Welcome to the Mystery Docket. I'm here to share stories that matter. Stories that remember victims, reveal warning signs, and help us understand how tragedy unfolds. Today's case spans nearly 60 years and involves one of history's most persistent identity frauds. It's the story of a woman who convinced herself and others that she was someone she wasn't, and the real victims whose memory she exploited. This is a case about grief, manipulation, and how desperate hope can blind us to red flags that seem obvious in hindsight. It's also about the real Anastasia Romanov, a 17-year-old girl whose life was cut short, and whose identity was stolen long after her death. Before we begin, this story involves discussion of mass murder, mental health struggles, and psychological manipulation. Please take care of yourself while listening. Let's start with who Anastasia really was, because that's where this story begins. Grand Duchess Anastasia Nikolaevna Romanov was born on June 18, 1901, in Peterhof Palace, Russia. She was the youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra, a spirited, mischievous teenager who brought laughter to her family during increasingly dark times. Those who knew Anastasia described her as clever, tomboyish, and fiercely loyal to her family. She loved photography, playing pranks on her tutors, and performing in family theatrical productions. Her letters reveal a witty, observant young woman who nicknamed herself Schwibzik, meaning little imp, because of her playful nature. Anastasia had dreams beyond the palace walls. Despite the political turmoil surrounding her family, she talked about wanting to marry for love someday and hoped to see more of the world beyond Russia. She was particularly close to her hemophiliac brother Alexei, often keeping him company during his painful episodes. In 1918, at just 17 years old, Anastasia was murdered alongside her parents, siblings, and loyal servants by Bolshevik revolutionaries in a basement in Ekaterinburg. Her life, full of promise and cut tragically short, would later become the foundation for one of history's most elaborate deceptions. Our story really begins in 1920 Berlin, 2 years after the Romanov massacre. Germany was struggling with post-war chaos, and the city was filled with Russian refugees fleeing the revolution. Among them were many former nobility who had lost everything, including several people who had known the Romanov family personally. Into this world of displaced Russians stepped a young woman who would eventually call herself Anna Anderson. But first, let me tell you who she really was. Her actual name was Franziska Szenskowska, born in 1896 in Poland. She had come to Berlin as a factory worker, living in poverty and struggling with what we would now recognize as serious mental health issues. Franziska had experienced significant trauma. She'd lost her job, had been involved in an abusive relationship, and was showing signs of what modern psychiatrists would likely diagnose as dissociative identity disorder or severe PTSD. In February 1920, Franziska attempted suicide by jumping from a bridge in Berlin. She was pulled from the canal and taken to a psychiatric hospital, where she refused to reveal her identity. For 2 years she remained silent, known only as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. Here's where the first major red flag appears, though it would take decades for people to recognize it. Franziska possessed an unusual ability to absorb and mirror the personalities and stories of those around her. Hospital staff noted that she seemed to unconsciously adopt the mannerisms and speech patterns of other patients and visitors. This psychological adaptability would become the foundation of her greatest deception. In 1922, everything changed when a fellow patient at the asylum suggested that the mysterious woman might be one of the lost Romanov daughters. The idea wasn't completely far-fetched. Rumors persisted that some family members might have survived the execution, and several women had already come forward claiming to be Anastasia or her older sister Maria. But here's what makes this case so chilling from a psychological perspective. Rather than simply claiming to be Anastasia for attention or money, Franziska seemed to gradually convince herself that she actually was the lost princess. The red flags that emerged during this transformation reveal a pattern we now recognize in cases of factitious identity disorder. Red flag number 1. Selective memory. Anna claimed to have lost most of her memories from trauma, which conveniently explained why she couldn't answer detailed questions about Anastasia's life. When pressed for specific details, she would become upset or claim the memories were too painful to discuss. Red flag number 2. Contradictory stories. Her account of how she survived changed multiple times. Sometimes she said she was rescued by a sympathetic guard, other times by a Polish soldier who later became her lover. These inconsistencies should have been immediate warning signs. Red flag number 3. Language inconsistencies. While Anna spoke some Russian, linguistic experts noted that her accent and grammar were more consistent with someone who had learned Russian as an adult, not a native speaker from the royal family. Red flag number 4. Physical evidence problems. Anna was several inches shorter than Anastasia had been, and had different colored eyes. She explained these discrepancies as results of her injuries, but medical experts were skeptical. Red flag number 5. Emotional manipulation. When questioned too closely, Anna would suffer dramatic breakdowns or health crises that effectively ended the interrogation and generated sympathy from supporters. Perhaps most concerning was how Anna seemed to study every person who visited her, unconsciously absorbing their memories and stories about the Romanov family, then incorporating these details into her own narrative. What makes Anna Anderson's case so psychologically complex is that she didn't operate alone. She was surrounded by people whose own trauma and grief made them vulnerable to manipulation, and who inadvertently helped her perfect her deception. Russian exiles in Berlin were desperate for connection to their lost homeland. Many had known the Romanov family personally and were haunted by guilt over their inability to save them. When Anna appeared, she represented hope that something good had survived the revolution. Nicholas von Schwab, a former Russian army officer who became one of Anna's first supporters. Von Schwab had served the imperial family and felt personal guilt about their fate. His emotional investment in believing Anna was real made him overlook obvious inconsistencies in her story. Here's where the case becomes truly disturbing. Well-meaning supporters unknowingly coached Anna by correcting her mistakes and filling in gaps in her knowledge. When she got a detail wrong about the Romanov family, they would correct her, thinking they were helping her recover suppressed memories. Instead, they were teaching her how to be more convincing. Anna learned to present herself as both regal and vulnerable, a lost princess who deserved support but was too traumatized to care for herself. This combination proved irresistible to wealthy supporters who competed to house and finance her. Newspapers of the era were fascinated by the lost princess story. Media attention brought Anna more supporters but also more scrutiny. Her response was always the same: withdrawal and breakdowns, which supporters interpreted as evidence of her royal sensitivity rather than psychological instability. For decades, Anna Anderson's claim remained controversial but persistent. She had convinced many people, including some who had known the real Anastasia. But serious investigation gradually revealed the truth. The scientific evidence. In 1927, a private detective named Martin Knopf conducted the first thorough investigation into Anna's background. His findings were devastating. He traced Anna's fingerprints to Franziska Shanskowska. He found witnesses who had known Franziska before her transformation. He documented the timeline of her mental breakdown and suicide attempt. Family rejection. Most importantly, the surviving members of the Romanov family consistently rejected Anna's claims. Grand Duke Ernest Louis of Hesse, who was Tsarina Alexandra's brother, hired investigators who concluded definitively that Anna was an imposter. The denial pattern. When confronted with evidence of her true identity, Anna's response followed a predictable pattern: complete denial and emotional breakdown. Claims that evidence was fabricated by enemies. Retreat into illness or psychological crisis. Movement to a new group of supporters who weren't aware of the evidence. DNA evidence, the final proof. The case was finally resolved definitively in the 1990s through DNA analysis. Samples from Anna Anderson were compared to DNA from the Romanov family remains, which had been discovered in Russia. The results were conclusive. Anna Anderson was not related to the Romanov family. Further DNA testing confirmed what investigators had suspected for decades. Anna Anderson was indeed Franziska Shanskowska, a Polish factory worker who had constructed an elaborate false identity that she maintained for over 60 years. The real tragedy. In 2007, the remains of the real Anastasia and her brother Alexei were finally discovered and identified through DNA analysis. The 17-year-old girl whose identity had been stolen was confirmed to have died with her family in 1918, just as historians had long believed. Anna Anderson's case offers crucial lessons about manipulation, vulnerability, and the psychology of deception that remain relevant today. Red flags and identity claims. 1. Inconsistent stories. Legitimate trauma survivors may have gaps in memory, but their core story remains consistent. Anna's story changed dramatically over time. 2. Convenient memory loss. Be suspicious when someone claims to remember enough to support their claim but not enough to answer specific questions. 3. Emotional manipulation. Authentic trauma survivors don't typically use their pain as a weapon against questioners. Anna consistently responded to challenges with dramatic health crises. 4. Isolation tactics. Anna repeatedly moved between supporters, always leaving when people became too questioning. This pattern of isolation is common in long-term deception. 5. Resistance to verification. Legitimate identity claims can withstand scrutiny. Anna consistently avoided or rejected opportunities for definitive proof. How do vulnerable people become enablers? 1. Grief and guilt. People struggling with loss or survivor's guilt are particularly vulnerable to manipulation by those claiming to represent what they've lost. 2. The teaching trap. Well-meaning people often help suspected identity fraud victims by correcting their mistakes, inadvertently coaching them to be more convincing. 3. Investment escalation. Once people have invested time, money, or emotional energy in believing someone, it becomes psychologically difficult to accept they've been deceived. How to protect yourself and others. 1. Verify independently. Don't rely solely on the claimant's story or emotional presentation. Seek independent verification. 2. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate further rather than suppressing your doubts. 3. Set boundaries. It's possible to be compassionate without being financially or emotionally exploited. 4. Seek multiple perspectives. Talk to people outside the situation who can offer objective viewpoints. 5. Understand trauma responses. Learn the difference between legitimate trauma symptoms and manipulative behavior. Anna Anderson died in 1984 in Virginia, still claiming to be Anastasia Romanov. She had spent 64 years living a lie that became her reality. Legal battles. Anna's case involved multiple lawsuits over inheritance rights to the Romanov fortune. These legal battles enriched lawyers and cost supporters thousands of dollars, but Anna herself received relatively little financial benefit. She lived in modest circumstances for most of her life, dependent on the charity of believers. The human cost. The real cost of Anna's deception wasn't financial, it was emotional. Dozens of people invested decades of their lives supporting her, believing they were helping a trauma survivor recover her identity. When the truth emerged, many felt deeply betrayed and manipulated. Impact on historical understanding. Anna's case also complicated legitimate historical research into the Romanov family's fate. Her persistent claims muddied the waters and made it harder for historians to piece together the true story of what happened in Ekaterinburg in 1918. Mental health considerations. While Anna's actions caused real harm, it's important to understand that she was also a victim of severe mental illness. Modern psychiatrists who have studied her case believe she may have genuinely convinced herself that she was Anastasia, a psychological defense mechanism against unbearable trauma. In all of this, we must not forget the real victim, Anastasia Romanov herself. Anastasia was a vibrant teenager with her whole life ahead of her when she was murdered in 1918. She deserved to be remembered for who she actually was, a spirited young woman who brought joy to her family during impossible circumstances, not as a romantic myth or the foundation for elaborate deceptions. The real Anastasia never had the chance to fall in love, pursue her dreams, or discover who she might have become. Her identity was stolen not just by Anna Anderson, but by everyone who preferred the fantasy of the lost princess to the tragic reality of a murdered child. Her true legacy. Today, Anastasia and her family have been canonized as martyrs by the Russian Orthodox Church. Their remains rest together in St. Petersburg, finally at peace after decades of uncertainty. The real Anastasia's legacy should be one of family love, youthful spirit, and the tragedy of innocent lives lost to political violence. The broader message. Anna Anderson's case reminds us that when we romanticize tragedy or cling to false hope, we risk losing sight of the real people who deserve our remembrance and respect. The most fitting tribute to Anastasia Romanov isn't believing in miraculous survivals or elaborate escapes. It's remembering her as the real person she was, and honoring the life that was cut short. The Anna Anderson case spans nearly a century and teaches us crucial lessons about manipulation, vulnerability, and the power of wishful thinking. It shows us how psychological trauma can create both victims and perpetrators, sometimes in the same person. But most importantly, it reminds us to center the real victims in these stories. Anastasia Romanov deserved better than to have her identity stolen and exploited for decades after her death. She deserved to be remembered as herself, not as a fantasy or a false hope. Anna Anderson lived a lie. Anastasia Romanov died a truth. And it's that truth we must never forget. If you know someone who seems to be the victim of identity fraud or manipulation, trust your instincts but approach with compassion. The psychology behind these cases is complex, and both the deceiver and the deceived often need professional help. Thank you for joining me for another case on the Mystery Docket. What are your thoughts on how grief and hope can make us vulnerable to manipulation? Let me know in the comments below. Remember, we share these stories not for entertainment but to learn, to remember, and to protect ourselves and others from similar tragedies. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other. Disclaimer: the following story is based on historical records, research, and publicly available information. It is presented for educational and documentary purposes only. I am not responsible for how this information is used or interpreted.